Hello, friends, and welcome to The Membership, a podcast about the life and work of Wendell Berry, the Kentucky farmer, poet, novelist, essayist, activist, and thinker. My name is Jason Hardy, and I'm joined as usual by my fellow members.
This is John Pattison.
And this is Tim Wasem.
How you guys doing today?
Doing great. It's good to be recording again. It's been a little while.
Yeah, it has been.
Yeah, we've had a big gap. So yeah, it is really good to be here.
So I think we're actually closer in time to when we're releasing our episodes. Where we have been releasing episodes that we recorded back in the fall, and now this is going to be released closer to the time that we recorded it anyway. So.
Yeah, I think we had episodes that came out around Christmas where we were talking about how hot it was.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How unseasonably hot it was. It wasn't that unseasonably hot that it was that it was 90 degrees in December, but yeah. Not too far off.
We are not alone tonight. Tonight we are thrilled to welcome another member, our guest, Pastor Tim Ross. Tim has served as a pastor in the Christian Church for 38 years. He holds a doctorate of ministry from Milligan Christian Seminary, where he now also teaches. After serving as a cross-cultural missionary among the Maasai tribe in Kenya from 1987 to 1995, Tim became the minister of Hopwood Christian Church on the campus of Milligan College in 1996, and he serves in that capacity today. Along with his duties at the church and seminary, Tim also serves as a volunteer hospital chaplain, as a board member of Assistance Resource Ministries in Elizabethton, Tennessee, and as a board member for the Christian Holy Land Foundation, which supports Arab pastors in Galilee, Israel. He's married to his wife, Marcia, and they have 4 grown children. Tim, welcome to the membership.
Oh, thank you so much. It's so good to be with you guys. I'm a fan of the pod, and I've been listening right along, so it's a joy to be here with you tonight.
Oh, man, we're happy to have you.
Yeah. Good. Well, tonight we're going to be discussing Wendell Berry's short story, Watch With Me. But before we get into that, we wanted to let our listeners get to know Tim a little bit. So Tim, the first question we always ask all of our guests is, what is your Wendell Berry origin story? When did you first encounter his writing, and what drew you to it?
I think the first time I picked up a Wendell Berry book, someone gave me a copy of That Distant Land. And so I sort of came to Berry through short stories, and then I started picking up some of his essays. I remember being particularly struck by Why I Don't Have a Computer, or whatever the name of that essay was.
Yeah.
And thinking, who is this guy? And then I discovered that I had a couple of friends who were neighbors and colleagues of Wendell Berry. Some college friends were, one of these friends was actually doing a lot of his writing, his correspondence. And these are my friends, David and Tanya. And David's a pastor in Kentucky, and Tanya has worked a lot with Wendell Berry. So I started picking up some more of his books. I came to his poetry a little bit later, but I think I'll always have a deep love for his novels, and especially his short stories. I think they strike me as kind of home base.
Yeah, that's great. So how would you say that reading Berry has shaped the way you see your work as a pastor?
It's kind of interesting because, Berry, in one sense, doesn't seem to have a lot of love lost for pastors. And you may have noticed that whenever pastors show up, there's probably trouble that's getting ready to follow. But at the same time, he's deeply steeped in Scripture, and I found his work to resonate incredibly with the slow work of pastoring a body of people for a long period of time. I think you could change a few of the names and perhaps a few of the places, and the neighborhood that Berry writes about could easily be my own in the congregation.
This kind of goes back to to your origin story, but I have to throw in there that part of my Wendell Berry origin story is connected to you. And then I think I had only read, the first one I had ever read was Jayber Crow. And I think right after that, or maybe the semester I read it, I was a student at Milligan, and I remember going to lunch with you, and we were talking about various things, and one thing that came up was, you're like, I got this little book I want you to take, and I want you to read it, and it was his little Blessed Are the Peacemakers book, and that was probably the second thing that I read, and it was because you had handed that off to me, which I don't remember the context of the conversation, but I remember being really struck by that little book and how the I don't know, just the punch that little book packs. And was that an excerpt from something bigger? Do you know, or was that just its own standalone little?
I think it was its own standalone piece, probably written around the time just after 9/11, when it seemed that there was a bit of urgency about the message that he was trying to get out.
Yeah.
Jayber Crow was actually the second book that I was given. And it was given by a pastor in our area who just kept telling me, "You got to read this guy. You got to put down what you're doing right now and pick this book up." So I think Berry is often best shared.
Oh, for sure.
Tim, there's a university near me, George Fox University, and a few years ago I heard a story about a professor from George Fox. Or maybe it was their seminary. I can't remember if it was university or seminary, but they were giving a talk near me. And supposedly this professor said that if you want to understand what's happening in American Christianity today, you have to understand Wendell Berry. And I kind of want that to be true. I want there to be a great conversation happening about Wendell Berry and what Berry... the values that Berry expounds on. But I'm curious, in your experience, do you see many other ministers who are engaging with Berry's work?
Yeah, I certainly do, but I think they tend to run along a certain vein. I don't find a lot of folks who are converted from Fox News to Berryism. But I do find a lot of pastors who are already reading authors like Frederick Buechner, say, who find real natural connections with the writings of Berry. I think there's a strong minority, a wonderful fellowship of friends in the pastorate who love Wendell Berry and who are learning from him.
That's encouraging.
Yeah, for sure. Well, so we're here tonight to discuss Watch With Me. So this is a story that was set, and correct me if I'm wrong, guys, in 1916 in Port William time. It was published in 1994 in a collection of stories about Ptolemy Proudfoot and his wife, Miss Minnie, that was, I think it was titled Watch With Me, right? Do I have that right? Is that where it was originally published?
Yes.
Nice.
Yeah, the collection of Proudfoot stories, which that's the one that they had just re-released. What was that, 2 years ago?
Yeah.
They had that re-release of it, and I got all excited because I thought it was a new book. Definitely wasn't, because I didn't even realize at that point, once I figured out it wasn't a collection of new stories, I didn't realize that collection had existed on its own at another point until like 2 days ago, as I was getting ready for this, and had searched for it and saw the original cover. So it's just neat. It's neat to think about this as being part of a whole that it was intended to be, and not like sort of scooped together later. Let's just take all the Ptolemy Proudfoot stories and put them together. It's like, no, it's nice to know that they were meant to be together.
Yeah, definitely. Well, John, would you mind giving us a synopsis of the story?
Sure, yeah. So Watch With Me, as you said, takes place in early August 1916. And as you guys were just talking about, there are two main characters in the story. One of them is Ptolemy Proudfoot, or Tall, as he is affectionately known among Port William's residents and readers. And Tall is a conscientious farmer We first met Tall in the short story A Consent, which we discussed in episode 5. And that story told the tale of Tall's early courtship of Miss Minnie, the school teacher in Port William. And now 8 years later, Miss Minnie is his wife, and this story takes place over the course of, maybe a little bit more than 24 hours, 24 to 30 hours or so. And Tall's day begins sort of sideways. He has to go fetch 3 milking cows that had strayed. Then one of the cows steps with a manured foot right into the milking jug, ruining it. Then he tries and fails to shoot a cow snake that had been trying to steal eggs out of a hen's nest. And then Tall sets the shotgun aside, hoping for another shot at the snake, who had disappeared through the hole that Tall had shot in the wall. Finally, Tall starts hoeing some cabbages, and he thinks that his day is straightening out, but in fact, it's an unforgettable day that's just getting started, because over the ridge comes Tall's neighbor, Thacker Hample, and Thacker's nickname is Nightlife. And he got that nickname, Nightlife, because his vision was so bad that Berry says he could not tell daylight from dark, and therefore was liable to conduct his nightlife in the daytime. Nightlife is a young man. We don't know how young. I was thinking maybe in his 20s, because we know that he was young enough for Miss Minnie to have had him as a student. And we learn early on that Nightlife suffers in other ways besides just bad vision. He's poor. He comes from a long line of poor Hamples. He doesn't have much of a sense of humor. He is prone to get crazy when he's drunk. He's like many of the Hamples, he's mechanically gifted, but he's described as having an ineptitude that was all his own. And then, very critically, Nightlife is also described as being prone to spells, when he would be sad and angry and confused and maybe dangerous, and nobody could help him. And he was periodically sent to an asylum. The evening before our story began, Nightlife had tried to make himself the preacher at the annual revival of the Goforth Church, but the actual preachers had rejected him, and he'd made a scene, and then Tall had been asked to sort of usher him from the stage. And Tall had a feeling that episode wasn't over, and he was right. So Nightlife comes over the ridge in something of a daze, and he picks up Tall's shotgun, where Tall had leaned it against the shop, and Nightlife says to himself, "Why, a damn fellow just as well shoot himself, I reckon." And then he wanders away. And Tall and his friend Sam, who's there too, try to stop Nightlife, but they're careful not to get too close or to be too insistent now that Nightlife, who's clearly not in his right mind, has the shotgun. Tim, we'll talk in a little bit about an essay that you wrote about this, and you describe this story in your essay as a slow-motion chase, which I love, because from here on out, Tall and Sam follow Nightlife, though Nightlife doesn't seem to know it. They try to keep him in sight as he heads into the woods, but they're very careful not to startle him or force his hand so that he doesn't hurt himself or hurt them. They're joined along the way by several other young men who look to Tall for leadership, and Nightlife is in a daze. Berry describes him as being not himself, but instead the vehicle of something he suffered. He moved like a man in the concentration of urgent bodily pain, though the men knew his pain was not of the body. At one point, Nightlife actually walks right into the home of a couple just eating lunch, startling them between forkfuls of fried fish. And Nightlife says, and again in a kind of a daze, "Let us earnestly compose our hearts for prayer." And he prays a long prayer, and the couple who know Nightlife urge him to stay and eat with them, but he looks at them as if they're strangers, and his face is described as being in a blur of incomprehension, and then he walks out the door. So the men continue to follow Nightlife along the river, through the woods, through pastures, along streams, all throughout the day and into the night. And eventually they lose when it gets dark. They're able to follow him for a little while in the moonlight, but then the moon is covered by a cloud, and so they can't even go much further. And so they come out of the woods. They feel like they've lost him, and so they start a fire. They light a fire, and eventually they fall asleep. And then they're surprised the next morning when Nightlife is standing over them, and he says, "Couldn't you stay awake?" And he walks away again, and they follow him, and they've realized now that they're coming back, almost like in a circle, back toward Tall Proudfoot's home, and they go into the shop. I feel like, oh man, I'm just gonna pause here. I feel like this is a long synopsis.
It's all right. Just go for it.
Like, I'm trying to give them details, but man, this is taking way longer than I thought.
It's a long story, and it's not as long as you think. So
Yeah.
it probably feels like a long time because
Okay.
you've just been talking. But
Yeah,
you're
okay.
good.
Yeah, no, you're good.
All right. So, So I'll pick up from there. So they all end up inside Tall's shop, and Nightlife leads them in a hymn. Oh, I'm sorry. I should say too that a storm breaks out. So they're all running into the shop to get out of the storm, and Nightlife is in there too. And he says he wants to lead them in a hymn, and so they sing the hymn, "Oh, the Land of Cloudless Day," and then he preaches his sermon, the sermon that he had prepared for the night before. And then eventually he's startled out of this daze when the hen that the snake had been, whose eggs the snake had been trying to get, sort of startles him, and he comes back to himself, and they all end up having breakfast together. I am absolutely not doing it justice. It's an incredible short story, but it is remarkable. Like, there's a lot of tension. It's sometimes very slow, sometimes very funny, sometimes very sad. There's a lot happening here, and then it ends in a way that is very surprising.
And the ending in itself is, it's like it's the story itself bridges on novella, because there's a lot there, and it's a longer story or whatever. But the ending of it is certainly one of the more like typical short story endings, where they're not going to like tie up everything nicely and tell you everything that happens after that moment. It's more about just the moment that's captured right then, and so it is kind of an ending that's a little difficult to put your finger on, as far as what to make of it in some sense.
And I didn't talk about what he was actually preaching, because I think we'll get into that, what the sermon was, but because that's important.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's turn to Tim Ross. I guess we have to specify which Tim.
You can call me Timmy, like my family does.
Okay.
'Cause I have an uncle Tim, and he's Tim, and
Okay.
I'm Timmy. So if we want to do that for tonight,
All right, sounds good. I don't know if I'll do that.
I'll allow it.
Timmy and Dr. Tim.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
We would, if we call Tim Ross Dr. Tim, we don't have to call you Timmy, but we just will anyway.
Well, anyway, yeah.
I really regret telling you guys that. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Hey, I'm Johnny. So
Yeah.
my dad is John, so I'm Johnny.
Yeah.
Very good. Well, so Dr. Tim, one of the reasons we're excited that you're with us tonight, as John mentioned, you actually wrote an essay about this story. It was titled "Watch with Me, Wendell Berry, and Sitting with the Least of These." This essay appears in the collection From Each Brave Eye, Reflections on the Arts, Ministry, and Holy Imagination. It was edited by our friend Todd Edmondson and published by Shook Foil Press, which is an awesome name for a Christian publisher. little Jordan
Yes.
Manley Hopkins. But in this essay, you're sort of meditating on this story as a model of how Christian communities can provide a ministry of presence for people with real struggles. So I'm wondering if you might talk a little bit about that and what you're saying there in that essay.
Sure. Yeah, the essay was originally pitched to a bunch of Todd's friends, ministering friends, folks who did all kinds of different things, teachers and pastors. And the idea was that each of these folks was asked to think about some work of art. It could either be some kind of created art, a painting, a sculpture, a poem, written art. And we were asked to choose a piece of art that somehow spoke into our vocation, somehow spoke into our practice of our vocation. And so this story immediately came to mind for me because I think that this is really a gospel story. As much as he's often unhappy with organized religion, Berry's been deeply affected by the gospel. And I think if you squint your eyes a little bit, and maybe if your eyes are tired after staying awake all night with Tall out in the woods without anything to eat, you can begin to think that this sounds and looks a lot like gospel. First, there's the title, Watch With Me, which comes from the words of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane on that last night of his life, the night that he was betrayed, when his own soul was coming apart in prayer. He was bleeding drops of blood. He knew that his time was near. And he asked for the disciples the only gift that perhaps they were capable of giving him, which was simply to be present with him and all the goodness of it and all the terribleness of that hour. And so he said, stay here and watch with me. They, of course, were pretty much unable to do that. They slept until the moment of crisis came, and then they all ran off. But this concept of staying with people in a crisis and working together very much resembles the kind of congregation that I've served over the last 22, 23 years. I think this is a very layered story that Berry has written. It is a story about people who don't fit, people who are odd, people who are handicapped by the vagaries of life. And it's about the way that they fit in or they don't fit into a community. And I think that overall, Berry is really saying that every single person is important to the membership of a community. There's no one we can leave out. There's the ones who seem to be the weakest, the hardest to get along with, are perhaps even the ones that we need the most. And we see that not only through the character of Nightlife and his relationship with Tall, but we see it through the group of men who are following Nightlife through the woods in that long night. Some of them are jokers. Some of them are just hard workers. One of them is a guy that's pretty hard to get along with himself. They were joined by another guy who was known as a gossip in the community and an incredibly lazy person. And he was kind of harshly sent off by some of the guys. And Tall grieved even his loss. He didn't want to see anybody lost, and he missed him when he was gone. And so this story... Go ahead, Tim.
I was just going to throw in, Timmy, thank you. I was just going to throw in there that We can also include their wives dealing with the sort of mess all these guys have got themselves into. I love that little detail. And that's one thing about this story that I would just love to know more, is that you've got the wives of all these men who have grouped up at Tall's house and who are just kind of waiting it out. Like, what in the world have they gotten themselves into? They've been gone for 36 hours. This kind of like ragtag group that have all just kind of assembled as they go. And you can imagine them all kind of gathering one by one, just waiting for them to sort of sort this thing out or finish whatever mess they've gotten themselves into, so they can go ahead and move on with all the stuff that is mentioned in the story that they've been taking over for them, right? Doing all the milking and doing all the things that they were doing while they were off helping this man.
Yeah, thank goodness this was in a time before cell phones. Otherwise, they would have had to check in every 15 minutes.
Yep.
The story would have been a little different. But I see this
Find my iPhone.
I see this as a good paradigm of the congregation and congregational life. In congregational life, you can't fix everything. You can't fix everybody. And in congregations, everyone is important, or everyone ought to be important. And sometimes when tragedy strikes and when families come apart, when grief seems to be unending, perhaps the only gift, and maybe the best gift that we can give to people is to, as Tall would say, to stay involved, to be involved in their story, in all of its craziness, in all of its difficulty, and to be present and to see things through to the end. There was a real sense that Tall didn't want to lose anybody, and he worked hard with every effort that he could make to not only save this situation with nightlife, but to get these guys through as well. So I think it's a beautiful story and a great example of what congregational life is like at its best.
Tim, can I ask a follow-up question as well? Since you were talking about the New Testament imagery, there's when Jesus comes back from prayer, he sees his apostles that they've fallen asleep, and he says, could you not even stay awake? And of course, that is essentially what nightlife says to the men when he comes upon them at the campfire. But then when he does get back to the shop, he preaches that sermon. We're told that what Nightlife wanted to preach about at the revival was that he wanted to tell what it was like to be himself. Mm-hmm. And then the text for his sermon in the shop is Matthew 18:12, and it's the parable of the shepherd who has a sheep that goes astray, and so he leaves the 99 to go find the one. Can you talk about that story and how that fits in with who Nightlife is and his role in the community?
Sure. I think that we're in sort of a crisis time. I don't know, churches have probably always been in a crisis where the great temptation, is to pull in lots of numbers and to try to make everybody happy. And if you don't fit, then you eventually just work your way out of the community, or you're shunned by the community. But I love that section where Nightlife is, he's trying to tell people what it feels like to be the lost sheep. He's trying to tell people what it's like to be on the outside in a fumbling, halting way. He's screaming that message out to him. And so I think the best congregations and the best groups of members in a congregation are always those people who have an eye out for folks who are struggling, folks who are on the margins, people who make a lot of mistakes. And when you look at the gospel, that's exactly who Jesus hung around with as his disciples, and it's the people who were incredibly attracted to Jesus as well. I find it fascinating that the prostitutes and the tax collectors and people who were hated by the Pharisees and the leaders of the people. They ran away from them, but they ran to Jesus. He attracted those folks, and I have to think that it was because his eye was on them. He was looking out for them. He was reaching out to them. He was speaking their language, and he was touching them and being present with them in all of their difficulties. So probably the best, if we can emulate that in small ways in our own congregations, we'll come a lot closer than simply coming up with the latest big idea on how to draw people to a big service on Sunday.
Yeah. Hey, can I jump in? And I want to read something from the story to go along with what you were saying, Tim. This is part of the sermon, because this is one of those. You were talking about how Wendell Berry's stories, you change the names, you change the places, and it applies to where you are. This is one of those little sections where his kind of thesis of this sermon that he's giving could apply to just about anybody, especially to those who are disadvantaged. But he says, I'm going to read this section. Though Christ, in speaking this parable, asked his hearers to think of the shepherd, Nightlife understood it entirely from the viewpoint of the lost sheep, who could imagine fully the condition of being lost and even the hope of rescue, but could not imagine rescue itself. "Oh, it's a dark place, my brethren," Nightlife said. "It's a dark place where the lost sheep tries to find his way and can't. The slopes is steep and the footing hard. The ground is rough and stumbly and dark and overgrowed with bushes and briars, a hilly and a hollery place. And the shepherd comes a-looking and a-calling to his lost sheep, and the sheep knows the shepherd's voice, and he wants to go to it, but he can't find the path, and he can't make it." I love that last line. Hits me heavily every time I read it, but he knows the voice. He knows what it is, and he wants to go to it, but he can't find that path, and he can't make it himself. And it makes me think of Nightlife himself and of his need. He needs those other guys to be there for him, and he needs his community to do their best to hear him and to not write him off.
Yeah, a couple people that I just like to tell you a little bit about who absolutely fit into that. This morning I was at a state prison visiting with a guy who hopefully is going to get out this year, and our congregation's going to walk with him for at least a year, mentoring him and just hanging out with him and coming to know him. But he's just so frustrated by the system. He feels like he's trying to do everything he can to get where he wants to be, and he feels like it's just not working for him. And he reminds me of another friend I have, a guy who has really poor health, and a guy who pops in at the church every once in a while looking for help. And he's a guy named Robert. And Robert told me, he said, "You know, Pastor," he said, "it's hard being poor. It's really hard. It's hard work being poor." And I find that most of the folks that come our way with deep, struggling physical and mental needs, they're not quite as eloquent as Wendell Berry's characters, but they're very much like them. They speak the truth, and they tell you the way it is.
Yeah.
I've wondered if all of, as this story takes place, we're not told this, but I wonder if, as the story takes place, the revival is still going on back at the church.
That's a great question.
Yeah, undoubtedly.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting, how the pastors at that revival treat Nightlife. And I'm sort of wondering, all these guys have known Nightlife their entire lives, and his entire life probably, right? I'm thinking that it's common practice during a revival to have a visiting pastor. Is that would that be to you guys' knowledge? Would that be right? The revivals that I went to as a kid. Yeah. So anyway, these guys don't know Nightlife, and they treat him very differently. They sort of dismiss him and say, "No, you can't preach. That's what we're here to do, and we're going to go along with the plan." So their treatment of him is very different than his friends. And, I'm wondering, I think it's safe to say Nightlife is suffering from some kind of mental illness. A kind of mental illness that we're told is sometimes dangerous to other people, and certainly to himself. But yeah, we have this contrast in how people deal with his mental illness. We have these pastors, like you said, Tim. Pastors don't always get the best depiction of Wendell Berry, who sort of dismiss him, and then you have these friends who follow him, make sure that the community stays safe from him, and that as far as they can, that they protect him from himself. I'm wondering if that might sort of give us a model for thinking about a ministry of presence for folks who have real trouble with mental illness, depression, and other kinds of illnesses.
I think one of the coolest parts of the story for me was the way that Tall spoke to Nightlife at the revival. Do you remember that these guys were trying to sort of get him out of their grill, and they found Tall, who was the most sensible among them probably, and they sort of put it on him to talk this guy down off the ledge. And so it was really wonderful to me. And I think Tall, in my mind, and stands for a lot of people that I know, just regular folks in congregations who really do the bulk of all the work. They're the folks who are getting into people's lives and in quiet ways oftentimes that are never known, and they're speaking words of love and goodness and redemption to people, and just letting people know how much they care about them. So everything that Tall did after that, his 2 days of walking and wandering and following Nightlife in times of great danger, to me, were really just the next step, the next chapter in that posture of love and gentleness and grace and goodness.
Yeah,
I love that you said that, because it's a reminder that the care that happens in the kind of congregation you're describing, the care is not left to the professionals. It's not only the pastor's job to care for the people, the broken people in the congregation or the broken people in the neighborhood, and there are broken people everywhere, obviously, and we're all broken, but it's everyone's job.
Yeah, one of the first incidents that I thought about as I read this story from the life of my congregation, we had a woman, wonderful sister, I'll call her Meryl, who was with us for a good long time, who struggled with mental illness. She was diagnosed as schizophrenic and paranoid, and she was an incredible artist. And oftentimes the pictures that she would draw would be of Jesus as the Good Shepherd, actually, and they were from her view, from her vantage point. She'd use a lot of found objects in these pictures, and they were just lovely. But she told me a story about coming to this church, and she got there before I did, and she said that on her very first Sunday there, she was so struck by the music that reminded her of the music of her home church, and it was an emotional moment for her, and she just felt like she wanted to be with these people. But she said she knew that she had to tell someone about the truth that lived within her, that there were hard aspects of her nature and aspects she couldn't control. And so as the service ended and the last amen was sounded, she turned to the first person that she found, the lady sitting next to her, and she said, I just think you need to know that you may not want me in this church. I love the service today, but I don't know if you'll see me again, because this is the kind of place that maybe doesn't want somebody like me. She said, I've been under treatment for pretty severe schizophrenia. I have kind of manic attacks sometimes, and I'm kind of paranoid about things. And she said that the lady just looked at her, smiled, never missed a beat, and said, "Oh, you'll get along just fine here. Take a number, We've all got issues." And, that's the kind of person, just somebody sitting in the pew with you who tells you it's okay, and who tells you that there's a place for you, no matter what your story is, no matter what your situation is. You can find membership in this place.
Mm-hmm. That brings to mind, is it Walter Cotman in the story? I think is he the character you had alluded to this earlier, how he was unkind to Putt,
yep,
to that character, and kind of shunned him and sent him off in this moment where he just was showing some real, I don't even know a good word for it, but he was just not very understanding of Putt's own situation and what Putt was bringing to the table. But later on in the story, after the sermon of this troubled individual who gives him this sermon, and time goes by, and in the story it says that Elton Penn came up to him later and said, "Well, did he make sense? I mean, did you feel for him?" And this is the character who we're supposed to think is the least understanding, even though he's stuck with the journey. He says, "Me? Of course I felt for him. The son of a bitch could preach." That, and that's a kind of a sort of a regular occurrence through Berry's stories, and that, like, well, the fact is he did what he did very well, and I'm not gonna discount that for him. Just that very practical kind of nature of all the troubles that come with nightlife. He's like, well, yeah. Guy could preach. He's talented. He knew what he was doing, or he felt it.
I love these nuanced characters who aren't just black and white, and I find that to be more true in congregations. There's so much that happens that's secret, that people don't talk about. There's so many kindnesses that people offer, and certainly there are people who don't get it. And there are folks who are rough on other people, mainly themselves. But yeah, who wants to be known by their worst acts or their worst characteristics? People are incredibly nuanced, and they can always surprise us by the ways they can turn around quickly.
Yeah, I mean, Tall sort of finds himself in the unenviable position. Not only is he's the oldest person in this party that's following after nightlife, and it's his gun, so he feels the most involved, and he's having to, not only is he have this crisis that he's having to deal with, but he's also having to manage all these personalities of all the folks there, and Tim Ross, I was wondering if that hit a little too close to home for you as the pastor of a church where lots of personalities are getting involved and things like that.
Oh, I don't know. I don't think that Tall is a Jesus figure, and I don't consider myself to be one either. But I think we're disciples.
Sure.
I think about Jesus when he came out of a village that didn't receive him, and James and John, the sons of thunder, ask, "Do you want us to call down thunder and lightning upon these guys? Do you want us to call down fire from heaven and wipe these guys out?" And that's not so different from Mr. Cotman in this story. And and I think that all these guys were disciples. They would never consider themselves that. They would never think of themselves in that way. But yet their feet stayed with the journey, and it became kind of a sacred journey.
Yeah, I was wondering, a good portion of your essay, you talk about pilgrimage, and the idea that a journey undertaken that sort of takes you out of your daily life can really change you, and you see that element kind of going on with Tall and his companions. I wonder if you might say a little bit more about that and what you see going on there.
Sure. As I was reading this story, I was also doing a lot of work on pilgrimage and rites of passage. And there's been a lot of anthropological work done on rites of passage, I suppose religious rites of passage, but also rites of passage in traditional societies. And from my work in Africa, that got me excited. But I began to read the work of some anthropologists from University of Chicago, Victor Turner and his wife Mary, and they wrote about rites of passage. And these are those events where people are trying to come close to what they consider to be the holy, the sacred. And there are lots of different ways that societies do that, some through their ceremonies, maybe circumcision ceremonies, or marriages, or events where age groups are being divided up. Sometimes I think we're more familiar with religious ceremonies like baptism or the Lord's Supper or even Christian pilgrimage. But there are some patterns that all of these sacred journeys take. And I found those same patterns in this story. First of all, there is the coming out from regular society and the beginning of a sacred journey. And it's people who are pulled out of their regular society. And these guys, it was an accident, they thought, but they found themselves together. And they began to gather more people that came to them to help. They were pulled out of common life, and even the day and the night began to seem very strange to them. They weren't eating, they were kind of half lost all the time, and it took on sort of an eerie, otherworldly character. The anthropologists say that in a pilgrimage, people enter into what they call a liminal experience. Liminal is the Latin word for threshold, and so this is a time when you're at the threshold. You're no longer what you were, but you're not quite what you're becoming yet, and the experience itself begins to remake you. And so these folks were also, I think, on kind of a journey in which they said over and over again, we didn't know what was ahead, we didn't know what was behind, we just found ourselves living in the moment, following nightlife. In a pilgrimage, communal aspects of the people that you're going through these experiences with are incredibly powerful. There develops what some have called a communitas, or a koinonia of the road. You go through all kinds of dangers and deprivations and hardships, and it takes everybody working together to get you through those things. In our text one time, Tall is talking how they have passed beyond hunger and thirst. They seemed to have become enlarged out of their bodies into sight itself. That sounds like a sacred journey to me. There's also laughter and joy in these pilgrimages, and times when you can let down. And there was this great line out of this story where Tall is saying, if I wasn't so hungry and if I didn't have nightlife to worry about, he said, I'd be having a pretty good time. And then it said, in fact, he was having a pretty good time anyhow. Even as they were going through these tough times, they were having a good time. And then in pilgrimage, you also have to figure out what it means to reintegrate into your society. And we sort of get that at the end of this story, where they come back home and they're with their people again, and there's this joyous, huge feast that's been set for them. And all of the work, of course, is going to take place in the days and weeks and months to come. But that journey is a journey they talked about for the rest of their lives. It changed them, it impacted them, and they couldn't have done it without each member of that group, including nightlife. High life. That's taking me back to Chicago beers, Tim.
There you go. Yeah. I want to to piggyback on that, because I mean that is, I love that the language of the pilgrimage, but what really fascinates me about this story is the dichotomy between their pilgrimage and then what Nightlife himself is going through. And so if that group of guys is the group that's in that koinonia of the road, and they're finding this unity or this new truth in one another, and they're going along on this journey, then I guess we would say that what Nightlife is going through is, it's like the Desert Fathers or something, right? Like, it makes me think of the wilderness, that he is kind of letting himself just disappear into the wilderness, that rage has built up and the problems have built up, and the level of misunderstanding in his life that he's dealt with, especially at this revival, is kind of the tipping point. He doesn't know what else to do besides basically say, okay, I'm going to grab a gun. I'm going to go to the woods. I don't know what's next, but I'm going. And he disappears in silence. And even in those moments where the men are talking about their hunger and their thirst, they keep measuring it against his. They're like, well, gosh, he has to be hungry. Oh, gosh, he has to be thirsty. I mean, he's finally stopping to drink, and so now we'll stop to drink. And and they also sort of refer to the fact that he seems to be under one of these spells or something, where they're like, surely he knows we're here, and he looks at us as if he sees us, but he doesn't respond. Yet he continues to choose to be alone. Except for the part where he stops by to see Uncle Othie before Uncle Othie joins him. But yeah, just that dichotomy there, like, really, really struck me, and I couldn't help but also think about the idea of wilderness and the idea of, you can learn from Nightlife himself, and that he's in the most frustrated he's been in his life. And the person I'm thinking of as I'm saying this is a student I have who's a special ed student, who deals with and tells me about the frustrations of how the rest of the world reacts, about coming to me and saying, I was in gym and we're playing basketball and they wouldn't pass me the ball, and it's frustrating. I wanted them to pass me the ball. I wanted to shoot that ball. I wanted to play, and that's the most frustrated they've been in the entire day. And that's kind of where he's at, where he's like, I wanted to preach, and so I just need to get out of here. I just need to head to the wilderness and try to make some sense of this.
Isn't it the task of the sacred community to see people like that, to stay with them, to watch with them, mm-hmm. to gently help them when they're out of their heads for whatever reason, and to be there when they begin to wake up. If you think about Jesus, some of the healing stories, think about the Gadarene demoniac, when he came back to his right mind, and he wanted to join the little Jesus band, and Jesus said, I'm gonna send you back to your family, back to your community, back to your people. I think about the prodigal son. We're told that when he came to himself, what a great line. And I think that's what we see from Nightlife. When he came to himself at the end of the story in that shop, he was relieved of the gun, and he immediately was invited into the midst of the community, and he realized that he'd been there all the time, perhaps, with these men, and off they went to the feast.
That's good. Tim, something that you talk about in your essay that I think is really fascinating is there is a very real sense in which Nightlife himself is the leader. The lost sheep is the leader of this group. It's easy to see Tall as the leader because everyone's deferring to him. They're all orbiting around Tall, but Tall is almost literally orbiting around Nightlife. Can you talk a little bit about that, about Nightlife as the leader?
That's a great point. Thank you. You just written my sermon for me for this week.
Just reread your essay. It's all right there.
Yeah, think about that. Think about the ways that we devalue people who struggle and people who hurt, and yet we're told over and over again in scriptures that these guys are actually the measure. They're the bar. how we treat them is a great example of how we're going to be treated. And the book of Hebrews talks about remember prisoners as if you were in prison with them. So I think that if anything, that the American church ought to really be paying attention to that. I actually started this essay. As I wrote this essay, it was right about the time when the guy shot up that movie theater in Aurora, Colorado, and I began to think, so what can we do? How can we stop this? This long line of shootings that's continued to this day, and I know there are lots of stuff that needs to be done, a lot of governmental work that needs to be done, but I can't help but think that the most important work that needs to be done is people in communities need to be engaged in the lives of people who are distant, and people who are on the outside, and people who are bullied, and people who are not quite right. And I just wonder how much good we could really do in our communities simply by paying attention to the least of these, rather than the beautiful families with the most money, which is kind of the folks that we usually gravitate towards.
Yeah, Tim, I'm going to quote you to yourself. In your essay, you say, in Berry's world, these members who have real struggles and maybe even mental problems like problems with mental illness like nightlife. These members are not problems or troublemakers to be chased away. They are necessary and valuable burdens, weighty but precious, that the community must learn to bear, and on the rarest occasions redeem. That really stuck out to me, especially with what you were saying about pilgrimage. It is certainly a perilous situation that that nightlife is dealing with, and that they're dealing with, and trying to make sure he doesn't hurt himself or anyone else. But they do come out on the other side of it with this experience of having this pilgrimage. That really struck me as we gain something by offering this ministry of presence to our members who are having these hard times too.
Yeah, I also think that what struck me in that paragraph was that the realization that we often seemingly don't do any good, or it seems like our best efforts are not enough. Mm-hmm. And I think that we need to recognize that we don't do this because we think we can stop the next shooter. We don't do this because we think we can make peace between people who can't get along. But we do it because that's what Christ has done for us. We do it because that's who we are. We do it because we believe in it, and whether the results really are secondary. Tall wished that he could save Putt, for instance. He failed in that. He felt badly about it. He wished that he wouldn't have gone away. He wished they would have stayed with him on this journey. And we often fail as well, but it needs to be part of our posture and our character to constantly have our eyes open, because in the end, we're all the lost sheep. We're all people who struggle in lots of different ways, and we've been found in lots of ways that have helped us, that have redeemed us, and it's given us a good work to do.
Yeah. I'll just read a section that I think is sort of the maybe the center of gravity of the story. It's at night after Putt has left, or right before Putt is about to leave, and Tall is sort of just starting to catch up with his hunger and his fatigue. And so, along with heat and hunger and the beginning of weariness, Tull's mind began to be afflicted by a sense of the futility, even the foolishness of what he and the others were doing. For a while, his thoughts lurched here and there as if unable to accept that there was not something better to do, or a better way to do what they were doing, some reasonability or sense that could be invited in. But he gave that up as he gave up with the same motion of his mind the hope of food or rest or comfort. It was not going to make sense, not yet, and maybe not for a long time, if ever. And for a while, maybe a longish while, there would not be food or rest or comfort either. When they got to the end of the story, he reckoned they would at least eat. He said to himself, I reckon it would be better not to have got involved. But he knew, even so, that hopeless or not, he would go along with nightlife until whatever happened that would allow him to cease to go along had happened. And he knew that Walter and Sam and the Hardys would keep going as long as he did, just as he knew that Put would not. He thought, I reckon I am involved. I just think that's a beautiful passage that just sort of describes the situation that Tull finds himself in there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and that's kind of a one-sentence description of Berry's philosophy of communal life, I think. Stay involved.
Yeah.
And that's what happens in this story with these men. Probably more often happens in his other stories with the women of the town when death or something comes along, tragedy comes along, and the women kind of swoop in and take over the household. He likes to tell those stories, and I don't have specific examples not coming to mind at the moment, but just the times of, especially in the war times, where you have somebody who's died and they have people, these women kind of swoop in. It's not they swoop in and say, well, here's what you're going to do, and here's how we're going to make everything better, and here's how to explain everything away. No, they just show up and they're there with them, and they're present with them, and they make them meals, and they're in the house with them, and they stay as long as they need to, and it's not something that's questioned by their families. It's just we have to be here.
Yeah, these commonplace postures and activities remind me very much of a story by Wallace Stegner. He's got this great story, or this great book, Wolf Willow, and in the middle of it, he tells a story about these cowboys who are out rounding up cows, and a big November blizzard hits, and they go through incredible hardships together. And there's a young hand who's kind of just trying to be a cowboy for the first time, and he's trying desperately to fit in with these guys. And in the end, near the end of that little tale, he helps to save a guy, and he comes back to the bunkhouse, and he's indignant because not everybody's not patting him on the back and telling him what a great guy he is and telling him what a hero he is. And there's a wonderful line where Stegner says that he realizes that what counts for heroics in the outside world is just called chores here in this world. And I thought about that in this text. These guys, they went on with their lives, and this just became another day. This is just chores, and I think that's what a good congregation or a good community does. They don't see this as heroic. They don't see it as saintly. They just see this as this is just the common work of a community.
And in your essay, you quoted something from Stanley Hauerwas that I really loved, that actually put into words what I had tried to say early on in this podcast, but I think is the perfect way to say it, where he says that this. His stories, that Berry's stories, well, I'll just read the quote. You said that, or Hauerwas says, Berry's novels do what is next to impossible in our time, and that is make goodness compelling. I usually hate sweetness because it always threatens to become sentimentality, and sentimentality is, I think, the enemy of the good. Berry's work is a sweet story about goodness wrought from the hardness of life. I love that, especially that last part, just that these things that's just what we call chores. There are these, sometimes in his stories, it teeters because there's good things being done, and it's like, I don't know if it's just the modern mentality, wanting to be cynical in moments and be like, well, nobody would do that. But yet, in this situation, it's or in this story, it's perfectly believable, and that's what it is. It's not sentimentality; it's goodness. It's doing the right thing and seeing people who do it from people who are doing the right thing from a place where they're dealing with the hardness of life.
There's a great
and they're not patting each other on the back.
Yeah, there's a great line in Watch With Me where Tall has gone out into the woods first to follow nightlife, and nobody else is with him yet. And just about the time when he begins to wonder if one of his neighbors is going to show up, he looks around and his neighbor's shown up. It's like, okay, yeah. And not a word needs to be spoken. They both are on the same page. And they're synced in the kind of ethos that they have.
Yeah.
And not to mention the fact that he's carrying a gun, and like a famously dangerous gun.
Yeah.
And he runs off with this gun, and they're like, "I'm gonna go follow him." And and then somebody, I forget the name of the character, but he says, "Well, you need to be careful because he might use that on you." And he's like, "Yeah, well, he might use it on you too." And he's like, "Yeah, I guess he might." And then he just keeps going. It's just
and then they find Burley in the middle of the night, and the first thing Burley says is, "Yeah, I seen that he had your gun. I mean, he recognized the gun."
Yeah. My favorite thing about Burley in this story is when when they're talking about like, where are we, and Tall says, "We're do you know where we are?" And Tall says, "Well, within about a 3 or 4 mile radius." And Burley's only answer is, "Right here."
Right here is where we are. That's right.
We're right here. That's where we are. It's such a Burley answer, and such a great one. We're right
great.
here.
Well, Tim, I'm glad you brought up that Hauerwas quote. Are you
talking to Timmy or Dr. Tim?
I'm talking to Timmy right now, but I guess Dr. Tim brought it up initially. So
yes, he did. Yeah.
So we talked in our episode on Pray Without Ceasing about the Tamara Hill Murphy article that sort of gave something like the limits of Wendell Berry's gospel. That sort of critiques him for sort of just having this agrarian communitarian utopia in Port William and not really dealing with the real problems that people in rural areas face. And she talks a lot about Hillbilly Elegy, the book Hillbilly Elegy, and that Berry's not really being realistic in his depictions, but I don't know. I sort of wonder if that line from Hauerwas sort of is a good counter argument that Berry may not be giving us hard driving realism in his depiction, but he is making goodness compelling, and there's something really useful about that in literature.
And Tim O'Brien has a really great essay about what he calls story truth. Where it's this idea that there's historical truth, there's the facts, sure, but there's also such thing as story truth, where you're experiencing something that did not actually happen, and maybe doesn't look exactly like it would have happened if it really did happen, but the truth that comes out of it is just as palpable and just as useful. And he was referring to to the Vietnam stories he tells, which are of course not exactly what happened while he was there, but they're probably more impactful than, and more, maybe they're even more truthful than any autobiography he would write about those experiences.
Let me add here that I think that story truth is exactly what I experienced the first time I read this story. You have to have your imagination fired in order to put the pieces together and to push it to action. It's the work of the imagination that makes a new way of living possible. And I think that a story like this, like the first time I read it, I thought immediately of 4 or 5 instances and scenarios and people in my own congregation who were living out the very principles that Berry's writing about so creatively. I don't think it's really a matter of whether it's an agrarian society or an urban society. I think these principles are pretty much timeless and everywhere.
Yeah. Well, in a word I came across recently by I was listening to the West Wing Weekly podcast, and someone used the term aspirational to describe Aaron Sorkin's writing in the West Wing and in other stories, and they were saying cynicism is easy. It's easy to be cynical, but there's something really great about well done aspirational fiction that helps us imagine those possibilities.
And sort of a double tie-in with that, with the Odyssey. There's that scene in the Odyssey where Odysseus says that hatred is easy. I mean, of course, there's different translations but his son Telemachus is getting so upset about all these men in his house, and his dad walks in after being gone for all this time, and he's covered in all of his, or he's in his disguise, and his son starts to get mad, and he says that hatred is easy. You can don't show hatred. Mm-hmm. Just be patient. Which of course I'm skipping over the fact that the end of that story is him murdering like 30 people. But I was saying it's a double connection because the Odyssey did come across my mind as I was reading the story, and just the kind of hero's journey or something of Tall, and as he's assembling his team. It's like a hillbilly Ocean's 11 or something where he's trying to to help a friend, you know.
Walter Brueggemann's one of my great mentors, and he's an Old Testament prof, but he's written this wonderful classic book about the prophetic imagination. And he talks about how our change happens first in the imagination of people. And the prophets, in this case, give us new ways of seeing reality, seeing our reality. And action oftentimes follows that.
Yeah. Well, guys, this is a really long story, and we, of course, as usual, we're only sort of scratching the surface. Are there other passages or sections that you guys wanted to talk about before we wrap up today?
I wanted to just reference the fact that I think Tall and Nightlife are a really fascinating duo when you put them together in a story. Just on the writing side of it, that I think that pairing those two together is absolutely perfect. That Tall seems exactly like the kind of person who would fall into this, with exactly the kind of person like Nightlife, and he does such a good job of describing these two characters in the story. I know he describes Tall as being somebody who's, and I don't have the quote right in front of me. I can find it in a second, but it's where his hair is always tousled. No matter how much Miss Minnie tries to keep him in order, his shirt always comes untucked, and he's always it's almost like he's too large for life, that he just kind of bursts out of his clothing, and you put a hat on him and his hair shoots out the sides, you know. And then about Nightlife, he describes him as, I love the line where he says that he said he was a handful, plain enough, but it was as though when he was a baby, his mechanically minded siblings had taken him apart and lost some of the pieces, which they then replaced with just whatever they found lying around. He just has such a amazing, he just nails it. He gets the characters just right, especially setting the tone there at the beginning of the story. And I have to share this with you guys, which is totally unrelated, but I have a student who did exactly what Wendell Berry did today, and he described himself. And we talked about this in that poem. He's trying or in the sermon, he's trying to say what it felt like to be himself. And we're doing this podcast project with my students, and he was trying to describe what his voice sounded like. And after he said this, I laughed for like 2 full minutes. But he's like, "And my voice," he's like, "I basically sound like a white Morgan Freeman with a sinus infection." And I was like, yeah. And I laughed, and all I could say, I was like, that is 100% what you sound like. It was amazing. Yeah. Sorry, that was a total tangent, but I've been laughing about that all day. Yeah. But I love that pairing. I love these two characters together, and it's also it's a pairing that's fascinating. Like in the first example that jumps into my head is No Country for Old Men, but like stories where you have two perfectly paired characters who almost never see each other, you know? Like they never come they come face to face for like 5% of the story. But just the fact that those two characters are in the same world in the same time seems so appropriate. And that has to be hard to do as a writer, to pair two characters so nicely that don't actually come face to face a whole lot.
I'll just say that I love the scene where nightlife bursts in on Aunt Cordy and her husband, and she's got such a great line. She says, "What is this foolishness? Sit down and let me fix you a plate." This nut comes in carrying a shotgun, and she's wanting to feed him, and I just think that the place of eating together and food is such a powerful image, not only through all of Wendell Berry's works, but through the biblical text as well. And there's certainly that end scene has echoes of the great banquet, I think, that are lovely.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a line towards the end of the story when, I mean, obviously these guys are all hungry. They've missed 3 meals in a row, and Hank says, "Looks like nightlife would get hungry sooner or later herself. Don't you reckon a good meal mightn't get him unfitted?" "It might," Tull said. "There's a world of sanity in a little meat and gravy. It sure would help me." So yeah, that's one. And of course, it does. The story does end with the banquet, the meal that the women have been preparing, hoping that the men would come back to the house. So, John, anything else we're missing that you wanted to discuss?
Well, I don't know if missing is the right word, but I had kind of a strange association when I was reading this story. It reminded me, and this gets back to what we were saying about aspirational fiction. It actually reminded me of Lady Elaine in Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. Like Wendell Berry has written this about this character, Nightlife, who is difficult to be neighbors with. And that's who Lady Elaine was in the Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood show. In the land of make-believe, there was a neighbor, Lady Elaine, who was very difficult. She was ornery, was causing trouble, antagonistic, short-tempered, manipulative, and the neighbors had to figure out how to be a good neighbor to her. And I have a 5-year-old, and so we watch and have watched quite a lot of the new Daniel Tiger cartoon. And Lady Elaine in the cartoon, as much as I like that cartoon, Lady Elaine in the cartoon is not difficult. She is just as kind and sweet as all of the other characters. And I think that that's a missed opportunity. I think we need stories that, as everyone has been saying, that give us an imagination for what it means to love our neighbors.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, sort of a strange association, but it did.
I love it,
come
though.
to mind.
Yeah, that's great.
One other thing that I'll say, I know that these guys and their wives are all busy, but it struck me that with all of the work that they had to do, they still were leading lives that sort of allowed them to be interrupted. Like, they were available to be interrupted. And I know that I have a tendency to overcommit, to be way too busy, to be inflexible with my schedule. But I want to think about what it means to be interruptible, so that I can be there and available to the person right in front of me when my own version of this story comes up.
Yeah. Tall saying, and I reckon I am involved with this thing, and saying that, like, what was, I don't remember the quote exactly, but it was something like that what had been an interruption became a priority or something like that.
Became the work they had to do. I think it was something about the work.
Yeah. Yes, what had started as an interruption became just the work that needed to be done that day, and that's I'm with you on that. It's so easy as life gets busier and busier to always be concerned with making sure that you're just doing the things that are on your to-do list. But the fact that somebody might need you is something that is really easy to just sort of brush off.
Yes.
Yeah, definitely. Well, thanks, guys, and thank you, Tim Ross, for joining us tonight, and for sharing the work you've done on this story. We'll definitely link to that collection in our show notes if people want to check it out. I think it's actually available on Kindle as an ebook for pretty easily. So definitely want to point people in that direction.
Thanks, guys. It's been great to be with you tonight.
Yeah.
Thanks, Tim.
Tim, where can we, Dr. Tim, where can we find you and our listeners find you online?
You can find the church website at hopwoodcc.org. You can find me at tim@hopwoodcc.org.
All right. Thanks again for being with us.
Or come to Tennessee and see us.
Yes.
There you go.
Thank you for listening to this episode of The Membership. We'd like to thank our guest, Dr. Tim Ross, pastor of Hopwood Memorial Christian Church on the campus of Milligan College in Tennessee. Today we discussed Watch With Me by Wendell Berry, which can be found in the collection That Distant Land, copyright 2005, Counterpoint Press. It can be found in 2 other places as well. Watch With Me, which is a collection of 7 stories about Ptolemy Proudfoot, and the Library of America collection, Wendell Berry, Port William Novels and Stories, The Civil War to World War II. The essay that Dr. Ross wrote is found in the collection From Each Brave Eye, which is copyright 2013, Shook Foil Books. Links to all these books, as well as other show notes, can be found on our website at membershippod.com. We're also on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, all at membershippod. The Membership is a proud member of the Rabbit Room Podcast Network. To discover more great podcasts and to learn about sponsorship opportunities, go to rabbitroom.org/podcasts. Finally, we'd like to ask a favor. If you're enjoying this podcast, would you head on over to iTunes and leave a review or rating for us? We already have 55 5-star ratings, which is really encouraging for a podcast that's still just in season 1. We really appreciate it. And thank you for listening.